It was a typical evening at Fairmont Mall, one of those slow, quiet nights where the bright fluorescent lights cast long shadows across empty stores. The air felt thick with the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of the janitors sweeping the corridors. The mall was closing soon, and there was a noticeable stillness in the air as employees began to finish their shifts. Samantha, a young woman in her late 20s, had just finished up her duties at the clothing store she worked at. It wasn't her first job at the mall. She had been there for 3 years, but something about the place had started to feel off. It was subtle at first, like an itch she couldn't quite scratch, but it was there. And the source of that unease, as she would later realize, wasn't something she could explain away. Samantha had always taken the late shifts, staying behind to make sure the store was locked up tight. She liked the quiet of the mall when it was empty, but tonight that calmness felt unsettling. It wasn't just the loneliness. No, there was something more. She was walking past the display area near the mall's center when she noticed the mannequin. It stood there in a small boutique-like store, one that was barely noticeable unless you were walking past. The mannequin was dressed in a red velvet gown that shimmered under the harsh lights, a piece meant to catch attention. But what caught Samantha's eye wasn't the dress or the mannequin itself, it was its position. The mannequin was never in the same spot when she came in the morning. Every day its posture seemed a little different, just enough to make her wonder if she'd seen it in the same position the day before. But she brushed it off. After all, mannequins were meant to be adjusted for the displays. Still, tonight, something felt different. She was standing near the glass entrance when she noticed it again. The mannequin, which had been facing the window earlier that evening, was now turned towards the aisle, its blank, emotionless face staring into the shadows of the darkening mall. That shouldn't have been possible. Samantha knew she hadn't seen it like that when she'd walked by a few hours ago. Her breath caught in her throat, a cold shiver creeping up her spine. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at it. It felt wrong. There was something so deliberate about the way it had shifted. It didn't look like an accidental repositioning. And then, something worse happened. The mannequin blinked. Samantha's heart skipped a beat and her eyes widened. She didn't want to believe what she had just seen. It couldn't have blinked. Mannequins weren't alive. But there it was. The eyelids of the mannequin had clearly closed, then opened again, the pale plastic glinting in the dimming light. Her legs felt like they were made of stone as she turned around, her mind racing to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe the eyes were somehow malfunctioning, or it was a trick of the light. But deep down she knew she had seen what she had seen, and it terrified her. She quickly gathered her things and moved toward the employee exit. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she heard the sound of something heavy creaking behind her. She didn't look back. As she stepped outside into the cool night air, she felt a creeping unease. The mannequin. It hadn't just blinked, it had watched her. And she couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on, something that was no longer easily explained. The next day she told a few of her co-workers about it, but they laughed it off. "You're just tired, Sam," one of them said. "You're probably seeing things." But Samantha couldn't forget it. No matter how much they teased her, no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she knew that something wasn't right. And the idea of returning to the mall that night to close up alone, knowing that Mannequin would be there, waiting, kept her up long after her shift ended. But that was only the beginning. The following evening, Samantha tried to push the events of the night before from her mind. Maybe it had been her imagination playing tricks on her. The mannequin's sudden change in position could have been a coincidence, and her mind had likely exaggerated the blink. After all, who had ever heard of a mannequin moving on its own? But as she stepped into the mall, the oppressive feeling she'd been trying to suppress returned with full force. It was a little past 8 p.m. and the mall was nearly empty, save for a few straggling shoppers and the familiar janitors cleaning the floors. She made her way to the back office to begin her shift. Tonight, she would do her best to focus on the work, distract herself from her thoughts. But her mind kept drifting back to that mannequin. She told herself she had to check it again. It was silly, really. Why was she so focused on it? But curiosity gnawed at her, and before she knew it, she was heading towards the store where it stood. When she arrived, her eyes immediately went to the display window. The mannequin was still in its position from last night, facing directly toward the aisle, its blank face staring at the darkness beyond the shop. Samantha could almost hear her heart pounding in her chest. It hadn't been that way when she left. What was going on? But tonight, something was different. There was an eerie stillness about the store. The air was thick with the faint smell of dust, and the lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the glass. The mannequin's lifeless figure seemed to loom larger in the dim light. Its posture hadn't changed. Or had it? Samantha stepped closer. The mannequin's arms, slightly extended, looked as if it were reaching for her. A shiver ran down her spine as she thought about the blinking. She looked up at the mannequin's face, her breath catching in her throat. For a split second, she swore it moved. Not a big movement, nothing that would immediately be noticed by someone passing by. But Samantha had been staring at it for so long that she could swear the mannequin's head had shifted ever so slightly. Just a little tilt, as if it were slowly turning to look in her direction. Her heartbeat quickened and her pulse hammered in her ears. It couldn't be. But there it was again. An almost imperceptible tilt of the head. Slowly, so slowly, as if the mannequin was acknowledging her presence. Samantha backed away quickly, her breath shallow, fighting the urge to run. She didn't know what to think anymore. Was she losing her mind? Was the mannequin somehow being adjusted by the night crew? That night, after finishing her shift, she decided to take a different route home, away from the mall, away from the creeping feeling that something was watching her. She just needed a break, a moment of peace. But when she walked out of the mall, a cold wind wrapped itself around her. The feeling of being followed crept over her, and Samantha kept looking over her shoulder as she walked to her car, her keys digging into her pocket like they were some kind of lifeline. Every corner she turned, every shadow she passed seemed to be just a little darker than usual. She arrived at her car and quickly got in, slamming the door behind her. As she started the engine, she glanced at the rearview mirror just for a split second, and there it was. The mannequin. Its face, still expressionless, stared back at her through the back window of her car, illuminated by the dim light from the mall parking lot. It was impossible. She had locked the doors, and there was no way it could have moved that fast. But somehow, there it was. Samantha's heart skipped a beat, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She twisted the rearview mirror back to where it had been, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place, that something had followed her. She drove home in a daze. The image of the mannequin burned into her mind. She tried to tell herself it was a trick of the light, or perhaps her tiredness was playing with her perception, but deep down, she couldn't escape the gnawing fear that something far darker was at play. That night, she barely slept, tossing and turning in bed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the mannequin's face, its eyes unblinking, watching her, staring into her very soul. And the worst part? The part that made her stomach churn? She could swear, with every passing minute, that it was getting closer. The next day, Samantha arrived at the mall with a feeling of dread weighing heavily on her chest. She hadn't slept well. Every time she drifted off, she was haunted by the image of the mannequin, its cold, lifeless eyes following her every move. Her mind kept replaying the events of the night before. She hadn't imagined it. It had to be real. But the more she thought about it, the less sense it made. Mannequins couldn't move on their own. They couldn't blink. They certainly couldn't follow her home. Still, she felt like she was losing her grip on reality. As she walked through the mall's main corridor, Samantha tried to shake off the creeping feeling of unease. She wasn't going to let it control her. She was just being paranoid, she told herself. The mannequin was part of the display, and someone was probably adjusting it while she wasn't looking. She had to stop overthinking it. But then, as she passed the store again, her blood ran cold. The mannequin was standing in a completely different position. This time it was right up against the glass, staring out at the mall. Its head was tilted to the side, as though it were waiting for something or someone. Samantha froze, her heart thumping in her chest. She had just walked past that store only moments ago. It wasn't in this position. She knew it. She turned away quickly, her pulse racing. She didn't dare get any closer. If anyone saw her acting like this, they'd think she was crazy. But deep down, she knew what she had seen. Something was wrong. The mannequin was moving and it was following her. That night, as she went to her car, she looked around nervously, half expecting to see it standing in the parking lot waiting for her. But there was nothing. The parking lot was empty. For a moment, she felt a strange sense of relief, as if she had imagined the whole thing. She drove home, keeping her eyes fixed on the road. Every turn, every shadow in the corner of her eye made her feel like she was being watched. She sped through the quiet streets, the headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. When she finally pulled into her driveway, she let out a shaky breath, relieved to be home. She was about to get out of the car when her phone buzzed. It was a text from her coworker, Lucy. "Hey, I was just leaving the mall and saw something weird. You didn't happen to notice anything strange with the mannequin, did you?" Samantha stared at the message for a long moment. Her hands were shaking as she typed her response. "What do you mean?" Lucy replied almost immediately. "I swear, I saw it move. I was in the store earlier, and the mannequin was standing in the back of the display. I went to grab something from the front, and when I turned back, it was facing the aisle. I thought I was just tired, but it was like it was following me." Samantha's heart dropped. She wasn't crazy. Lucy had seen it too. Her mind was racing now. Was there some kind of prank being pulled on them? Was someone messing with her, moving the mannequin when she wasn't looking? But no, it didn't feel like that. This was something more. The mannequin wasn't just being moved, it was moving on its own. It was stalking her, following her in ways that couldn't be explained by mere coincidence. The feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance that night. She locked every door and window in her house, pulling the blinds shut, trying to block out the world. She kept her phone nearby just in case Lucy texted her again, but no message came. Hours passed, and the silence in her house seemed to grow more oppressive with every minute. Samantha finally fell asleep, her dreams filled with unsettling images of the mannequin standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her with those empty eyes. She awoke in the middle of the night with a jolt, her heart racing. She couldn't remember what had woken her, but she was suddenly wide awake, sitting up in bed, listening to the silence. The house felt off, and then she heard it. A soft scraping sound, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from outside her bedroom door. Her breath hitched, and she froze. She strained her ears, trying to discern what it was. The sound continued, a slow, deliberate scraping like something or someone was moving just beyond her reach. She held her breath, her body tense with fear. Then, without thinking, she grabbed her phone, holding it tightly in her hand. The scraping stopped for a moment, and the silence grew even heavier. Thud! A loud noise came from the hallway, followed by another scraping sound. This time, Samantha didn't hesitate. She bolted out of bed and ran to the door. She stood there for a long moment, listening, praying she was just imagining it. And then she saw it, a shadow in the hallway just outside her door. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, too still. But there it was, the unmistakable silhouette of the mannequin standing just beyond the threshold. Samantha's breath caught in her throat and she nearly screamed as she slammed the door shut, locking it behind her. She could hear the scraping now, louder, closer. The mannequin wasn't just moving in the mall anymore. It was here, in her house, following her into her very home. Samantha spent the rest of that night huddled in her room, her back pressed against the door, her heart hammering in her chest. The silence that followed the scraping sound was deafening. She dared not open the door, no matter how much she longed to. She couldn't shake the image of the mannequin, its cold, unblinking stare standing just beyond the door. The hours seemed to stretch on forever. By morning, her eyes were red from lack of sleep and her mind was clouded with confusion. Had it been real? Was she losing her grip on reality? Or was something truly out of the ordinary happening? But one thing was clear. She couldn't stay in that house any longer, not with that mannequin, if it was even a mannequin, lurking in her hallway. The first thing she did when the sun rose was call Lucy. She was desperate for answers, for someone to confirm that she wasn't going insane. "Lucy, I don't know what to do anymore," Samantha said, her voice shaky. "I think it's following me, coming to my house. I don't know what to believe anymore." There was a long pause before Lucy responded. "Sam, I don't know how to tell you this, but I've been doing some thinking. The mannequin, it's not just a coincidence." "What do you mean? What are you saying?" Samantha's voice cracked as she tried to understand. "Okay, listen, last night I stayed after my shift to take a closer look at it. I thought maybe I'd find a hidden camera or something. Maybe someone was messing with us. But when I was there, I noticed something. The mannequin didn't just blink, it moved." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean it moved?" "I mean, I watched it. It didn't just shift a little like we thought before. Lucy's voice faltered. "It started to walk." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. "Walk? Are you saying it actually moved on its own?" Lucy was silent for a moment, then whispered, "I think it's alive. I don't know how or why, but I think it's following us. And I don't think we're the only ones it's been watching." Samantha could hardly process what she was hearing. Her thoughts were clouded, but something inside her began to click. There had to be an explanation for all of this, something that made sense. She just needed to figure it out. After a tense conversation with Lucy, they agreed to meet at the mall later that day to investigate. They were determined to find out what was going on. If there was any chance of stopping whatever was happening, they needed to face it head on. That afternoon, they both arrived at the mall, meeting near the store where the mannequin had been kept. The place was eerily quiet, almost too quiet, as if the mall itself was holding its breath. Samantha and Lucy exchanged nervous glances before making their way inside. They were careful, moving slowly, trying not to attract attention. When they reached the store, it was empty, just as they expected, but the mannequin was there. And this time it was standing in a completely different position than either of them had ever seen before. It was leaning forward, as if it was waiting for them. "I don't know if I can do this," Samantha said, her voice trembling. "What if it's not just a mannequin? What if it's something else? Something worse?" Lucy placed a hand on her shoulder. "We need to find out. Now." Together, they approached the mannequin, keeping their distance but unable to look away. As they drew closer, they both saw something they hadn't noticed before. A faint, almost imperceptible seam along the mannequin's neck. Samantha's stomach twisted. "It's not a mannequin," she whispered. It's something else." Lucy nodded, her face pale. "I think it's a person. Someone is inside that thing." The realization hit them both like a punch to the gut. The mannequin wasn't moving because it was alive. It was moving because someone was controlling it from the inside. The two of them hurriedly backed away, their minds racing. Who could do something like this? And why? The answer came crashing down on them as they realized something even darker. Whoever was inside the mannequin wasn't just using it to stalk them, they were using it to follow others. It wasn't a supernatural phenomenon. It wasn't even a prank. It was a twisted, sick plan by someone who had figured out how to manipulate the mannequin's movements for their own purposes. Samantha's heart raced. She knew what she had to do, but it wasn't going to be easy. She turned to Lucy. "We have to find the person controlling it. We need to get them out of there before it's too late." The two of them ran out of the store, determined to uncover the truth behind the mannequin's haunting movements. But as they did, they noticed something chilling in the corner of the mall. A figure, a person, standing completely still, just like the mannequin. And as their eyes met, the figure's lips curled into a smile.